O katiti sivudlang mit Canada rimang mit no nakakak si mayuno udloriyaw.
The member is reading a statement in Inuktitut.
I'm honored to speak on National Indigenous Peoples Day. There are many stories that I could share. Inuit First Nations and Métis in Canada have made historic achievements. Of these achievements are the creation, education, and graduation of the Joint Degree Program in Canadian Common Law and Indigenous Legal Orders at the University of Victoria. In the remainder of my time, I thank the Indigenous elders and former students of the residential schools. By your sacrifice, we are regaining our strengths as Indigenous peoples. It is by your determination we are able to celebrate our heritages, languages, and hope for future generations. I am so thankful to you. Koyarivasi.
Member for Sydney, Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, today is Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada. And on top of celebrating Indigenous history, culture, and resilience, today also marks the one-year anniversary of Royal Assent of Bill C-15, the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples Act. UNDRIP breathes life into Aboriginal and treaty rights and concretely advances reconciliation. For over 30 years, Indigenous groups advocated at the United Nations and in Canada to be self-determining nations. UNDRIP turns the page on the colonial legacies of the past and onto a new chapter based on the recognition of Indigenous peoples' inalienable rights. As we collaboratively work to implement UNDRIP, it will be the foundation for a renewed relationship based on fair, just, and consensual relations between nations. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to not just celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, but continuing to co-develop legislation that will improve the quality of life for Indigenous peoples across Canada.
Over 10,000 days have passed since the people of Nishnawbe have had clean drinking water. Over 10,000 days without something that people count for normal in communities across this country. But for the people of Nishnawbe, they've not had clean drinking water for over 2 decades. This is a complete and abject failure of leadership. This government has to acknowledge that this failure must be remedied. So when will this government ensure that the people of Nishnawbe and all First people of this land have access to clean drinking water?
Hear, hear. Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Leader of the NDP for asking a question on Indigenous issues on this Indigenous Peoples Day. It is extremely important that we deliver clean water to people right across the country. That's why we made a commitment on ending long-term boil water advisories. When we got into office in 2015, there were 109 in place. We have now lifted over 120, but there are more to do. And I can assure you that in every community where there is a long-term boil water advisory, there is also a plan, a project manager, and the resources in order to lift that drinking water advisory for good. We will continue the work to make sure we're creating real opportunity for Indigenous peoples across this country.
The Honourable Member for Nunavik.
Yesterday, this government announced billions for Arctic defense. Arctic sovereignty is always colonial and patriarchal. The high Arctic relocatees who live in Grise Fjord and Resolute can attest to being sent there without the resources they needed to survive and to thrive. Investments in the North need to help Northerners access safe housing, clean drinking water, and fresh food. Current investments are not working. How will Nunavik benefit from the billions being invested in Arctic defense?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know that protection and sovereignty in our Arctic happens and passes through the people who lived there for millennia. And that's why in our investments in northern security, in our investments in NORAD modernization, the Nunavummiut, the Premier of Nunavut, PJ Achiaguk, and others, including Tano Bed and the ITK, have been involved in these discussions, because we know that as we build infrastructure for safety and protection in the north, we need to be hand in hand with the people who live there and create benefits for them as well as we invest in safety in the north. That's what we will continue to do, hand in hand in the true spirit of partnership and reconciliation.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals' failure to fund a single new shelter or transitional home since announcing their violence prevention strategy in 2020 is putting Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people at risk. And this inaction is costing lives. We need oversight. Call for Justice 1.7 of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for an independent ombudsperson and tribunal to ensure accountability. When will the minister implement this call for justice?
Honourable Minister, or the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, addressing the ongoing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ+ is a whole-of-government approach which requires living up to our goals as a country and all the calls for justice. That is why Budget 2021 put $2.2 billion over 5 years to address the violence towards missing and murdered Indigenous women. We will ensure our initiatives are trauma-informed and focused on those who are still suffering in silence, as well as those who are courageously speaking out to put an end to this strategy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton, Griesbach.
This government says that housing is a human right, but in my riding of Edmonton-Griesbach, the lack of housing is an emergency. In the last 3 years alone, 453 people have died on the streets of Edmonton because they didn't have shelter, many of whom are Indigenous. Under this government, the issue is getting worse. The Liberals are more interested in big developers' profits than putting a roof over people's heads. People in Alberta Ave and across my community aren't seeing results. When is this government going to drop the talking points and build homes for people that they can't afford?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the honourable member's concern and important question on this issue. We've invested in the Rapid Housing Initiative, for example, a program that is aimed at the most vulnerable, and the member city of Edmonton has actually benefited to the tune of hundreds of permanently affordable new homes for the most vulnerable through our investments in the co-investment fund and our expected investments through the Housing Accelerator Fund, even bringing forward future money to this year to get more money out the door is to the tune of 22,000 new affordable homes for the most vulnerable. There's more work to be done, but we've made a lot of progress, Mr. Speaker.
Outstanding. Way to go on,